The storm hit Colby County, Texas, like a freight train made of fury, and Mae Fletcher had nowhere left to run. She had been walking since dawn, her boots splitting at the left sole, her coat soaked through to the wool lining underneath, and her carpetbag growing heavier with every mile of mud-slicked road. The year was 1881, and the open range of West Texas was no place for a woman alone, especially not at nightfall when the sky cracked open and turned the red clay earth into rivers of rust-colored water. She had left Abilene 3 weeks prior with nothing but the clothes on her back, $32 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and a determination so fierce it burned hotter than any hearth she had ever warmed herself beside. The farm she had grown up on had been swallowed by debt after her father passed in February. The man she had been promised to, a cattle broker named Silas Prout, had taken what little she had left in the way of savings with promises of investments that never materialized, and then had the audacity to disappear westward without a word. So Mae Fletcher, 26 years old, brown-eyed and harder-jawed than most people gave her credit for, had pointed herself in the only direction that seemed to offer something other than a slow death, forward. She saw the ranch house first through the rain, just a dark outline against the bruised purple sky, and then the bunkhouse to its left, and then the barn beyond that. The fences were wooden and solid, the kind that took years and intention to build. Someone cared about this land. A hand-painted sign on the gate post read Donnelly Ranch, and below it in smaller letters, established 1873. She stood at that gate for a long moment, the rain hammering the brim of her hat flat against her forehead, and weighed her options. She had none. She pushed the gate open. She knocked on the door of the main house 3 times before the light shifted inside and heavy footsteps crossed the floor. The door swung open and Mae Fletcher found herself looking up at a man who filled the doorframe like he had been built specifically to occupy it. He was perhaps 32, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in a few days, and eyes the color of weathered pine. A deep, warm gray-green that regarded her with something between suspicion and alarm. He wore an undershirt and suspenders, a lantern held in his right hand, and the expression of a man who had not expected company at 9 o'clock on a stormy Wednesday. "I need shelter," Mae said. She did not beg. She stated it plainly, the way a person states the weather or the time of day. "Just for the night. I will sleep in your barn if you prefer. I will not steal, I will not cause trouble, and I will be gone before sunrise if that is what you want." The man studied her for what felt like a full minute. He looked at her split boot, at her soaked coat, at the carpetbag in her hand, and then he looked at her face, and something in his expression softened fractionally, the way ice at the edge of a river softens in March slowly and with resistance. "Name," he said. "Mae Fletcher, from Abilene, heading west. Heading west in a storm without a horse or a wagon. The horse did not survive the creek crossing outside of Meridian. I have been walking since." He was quiet for another moment. "You can have the bunkhouse," he said at last. "My hands are at the south pasture tonight watching a calving situation. It is empty and dry. There is a stove in it and a cord of wood beside the door. I will not have a woman sleeping in the barn." "I am not asking for charity," she said, and she meant it without being rude. It was simply the truth of who she was. "I am not offering charity," he replied with the first suggestion of something that might eventually become a smile. "I am offering a dry roof. There is a difference. Go around the east side. The door faces the oak tree." He closed his door, and Mae stood in the rain for one breath, too, and then she walked around the side of the house toward the bunkhouse. His name, she would learn the next morning, was Orville Donnelly. He was 33 years old, had built this ranch from raw land with his own 2 hands and the labor of 2 loyal ranch hands, a man named Cutter Hayes and another called Pinto Jack, both of whom were in fact stationed at the south pasture that night attending a difficult calving. Orville had inherited the land from his father, but not the house, not the barn, not the fences, not the water troughs, not any of it those things he had built. His father had left him 300 acres of untamed Texas scrubland, and a note that said simply, "Do something with it." He had. He ran 200 head of cattle, grew enough winter wheat to see himself through the cold months, kept a kitchen garden that his mother would have approved of, and lived entirely alone in a house with 4 rooms, one of which he had never properly furnished. But Mae did not learn any of this until morning. That night she entered the bunkhouse, found it exactly as advertised, dry, cold, but improvable, with 4 wooden bunks along the walls, a potbelly stove in the center, and that cord of wood just outside the door. She built a fire with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, stripped her wet coat and hung it on a nail, and sat on the nearest bunk to remove her boots. The left one came apart entirely in her hand, the sole separating from the upper with a sound like a sigh of surrender. She set both boots near the stove to dry and then sat in her wool stockings and looked around the small space. The roof caught her eye immediately. There was a seam along the northeast corner, barely visible in the firelight, where 2 boards had separated. Rain was not coming through tonight, not enough of a gap for that, but the wood had swollen on one side and pulled away on the other, and she could see the pale line of sky between them whenever the lightning flashed outside. Come spring, she thought, that will be a leak. Come a hard rain this season, depending on which way the wind blows, it will be worse. She stood on the bunk to look closer, ran her fingers along the gap, assessed the damage with the eye of someone who had spent her childhood patching a farmhouse that was always one season away from falling apart. Her father, God rest him, had taught her the work. Chester Fletcher had believed that a person who owned land owned everything that land required, including the knowledge to maintain it, regardless of whether that person was a man or woman. Mae had climbed her first roof at age 9, swung a hammer at 11, and by the time she was 15 she could reshingle a section of barn roof faster than most grown men in their county. It was not a skill anyone had asked for and not one that had made her particularly marriageable, according to certain opinions in Abilene, but it was hers and she kept it close. She looked at the roof seam for a long moment, then looked at the bunk, then looked back at the roof. She pulled her coat back on. It was still damp, but it would do. She found what she needed outside. Along the side of the bunkhouse there was a lean-to storage area with timber scraps, a wooden crate of mixed nails, a hammer that had seen better days but was functional, and a small hand saw. The rancher, whoever he was, kept an organized property. Things were where they ought to be. She appreciated that. She worked for 2 hours by the light of the lantern she had found hanging just inside the bunkhouse door. She worked carefully and quietly, not wanting to wake the man in the main house, which stood perhaps 40 feet away. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, which actually helped. She could feel where the wood was pulling and what angle the water would travel. She cut 2 narrow battens from the timber scraps, fitted them precisely along the gap where the boards had separated, and nailed them into place with a methodical patience that the storm could not interrupt. She checked her work 3 times, sealed the far end with a piece of oilcloth she found tacked to a post in the lean-to, and then climbed down in the gray hour before dawn, her fingers cold and her hair loose from its braid. She put away every tool she had used, stacked the leftover timber scraps back as she had found them, and returned to the bunkhouse. She ate the last of her road bread, hard and slightly stale, and drank water from the pump just outside the door. She pulled her dry coat back on over dry clothes, repacked her carpet bag, and sat down to wait for sunrise. She had every intention of leaving before anyone woke up. She had not counted on the sound of boots on the porch of the main house at 5:30 in the morning, which was, as she would later learn, the exact time Orville Donnelly began every day of his life. He came around the east side of the house with a tin cup of coffee in hand and stopped when he saw her standing at the bunkhouse door, carpetbag in hand, coat buttoned to the throat. He looked at her. He looked at the bunkhouse roof. He looked at her again. The 2 new battens were visible from the ground, pale wood against the weathered gray of the older boards, neatly placed, clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing. "You fixed my roof," he said. "You had a gap forming in the northeast corner," she said. "Come a spring rain it would have been a proper leak. I used timber from your lean-to. I left the surplus stacked exactly as I found it." He stood very still, looking at the repair. He walked closer to the bunkhouse and looked up, turning slightly to check the angle of the patching against the pitch of the roof. He pressed his lips together in the manner of a man who is trying not to show that he is impressed. "You did that in the dark," he said. "It was not quite a question. I had a lantern, and I know what I am doing." He looked at her again, this time with the full weight of his attention, and Mae held his gaze the way she held most things, steadily, without flinching. She was not a small woman, but she was not especially tall, and she had the build of someone who had worked hard all their life without turning angular from it. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's jaw and her own very particular brand of composure that made most people slightly uncertain how to place her. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "West. I have heard there is work in the towns along the Pecos River. Laundry work, mending, whatever is available. That is 3 weeks of walking from here. Maybe 4 without a horse. I am aware." He drank his coffee. She waited. The sky was turning pink along the eastern horizon, the last of the storm clouds pulling north, and the wet earth smelled like iron and cedar, the particular perfume of Texas after rain. "Can you cook?" he asked. "I can." "Can you do more than a bunkhouse roof?" She looked at him squarely. "What are you asking, Mr. Donnelly?" "I am asking if you can work. I have 2 hands who are about as useful in the kitchen and around the house as a pair of shovels, and I have been 3 weeks without a cook since Mrs. Alvarez went back to her family in San Antonio. I am asking if you want work, paid work, with a room in the house, not in the bunkhouse." Mae studied him for a moment. She had learned hard experience, the kind that leaves marks, to be careful with offers that came before breakfast. Silas Pruitt had made her an offer before breakfast once, but Orville Donnelly was looking at her roof repair with the expression of a man who had just been given something he did not know he needed, and that was a very different look than the one Silas had worn. There was no calculation in it, just a plain acknowledgement of a plain fact. "What is the wage?" she asked. He named a figure. It was fair. She had expected it to be less. "I will stay 2 months," she said. "After that I reassess." "Fair enough," he said. She stayed 2 months. She did not leave. But that, of course, is where the real story begins. Cutter Hayes arrived back from the south pasture that first afternoon with Pinto Jack half asleep in the saddle behind him, both of them coated in mud and carrying the general air of men who had spent a sleepless night in a field. The calving had gone poorly. The heifer had not survived, but the calf had, and Cutter carried it slung across his saddle bow, a small black and white creature that blinked at the world with the mild confusion of the newly born. He was a lean, sun-darkened man in his late 30s, Cutter was, with a long scar along his left forearm from a branding accident and a quick, sideways humor that he deployed like a tool, useful and precise. Pinto Jack was younger, perhaps 22, with a round face and a cheerful disposition that seemed immune to exhaustion or bad weather. Both of them stopped their horses when they saw me standing at the pump filling a bucket. "Morning," said me. "Afternoon, ma'am," Cutter said, with the particular courtesy of a man who has been around long enough to know that an unexplained woman on a ranch is something you greet carefully. He looked at Orville, who was mending fence along the north side of the yard. Orville looked up and made a brief gesture that communicated, in the language of men who have worked together long enough, that everything was fine and he would explain later. Me fed them supper that first night: salt pork, white beans, cornbread baked in the cast iron skillet, and a dried apple pie that she produced from supplies she found in the larder with an efficiency that made the kitchen feel like it had always been occupied by someone who meant business. Cutter and Pinto Jack ate with the focused attention of men who had been surviving on their own cooking, and Orville sat at the head of the table and watched me move around the kitchen with an expression he was not aware of wearing, something between admiration and the careful stillness of a man who is trying not to make something larger than it is. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" Pinto Jack asked on his second piece of cornbread. My mother, Mae said, sitting down with her own plate. A necessity. That pie, Cutter said, is the finest thing that has happened to me this week, and I say that having just delivered a live calf. Mae smiled, and it changed her face considerably. When she was not smiling, she wore a composed, watchful expression that was easy to mistake for severity, but when she smiled there was warmth in it, an honest and uncalculated warmth that caught Orville Donnelly off guard. He looked down at his beans. The days took shape. Mae was up before the men and had coffee on by the time boots hit the floor. She managed the kitchen, the garden, the mending, and the account books. This last because she had discovered, on her third morning, that Orville kept his accounts in a ledger that was technically correct, but organized with all the logic of a creek in flood season. She reorganized it without being asked and left it on the kitchen table with a note explaining what she had done. He found it at noon, read through the reorganized entries, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment with an expression she could not read. You have an eye for numbers, he said. My father had a farm, she replied, from the garden where she was turning the late-season soil. Numbers either make sense or they cost you. I learned to make them make sense. She heard him go back inside without another word. But that evening, he brought the ledger to the supper table, and they spent an hour after the meal going over the figures together, Cutter and Pinto Jack having long since gone to the bunkhouse. Orville spread the papers across the table, and Mae pointed out where the cattle tallies were running ahead of the feed calculations, and where 3 months of fence mending materials had been charged twice to the same supplier account. That is about $14 sitting with Harmer's Supply that you have already paid for, she said. He looked at the entries for a long time. I will ride into Colby Town tomorrow and settle it. You could send a letter first. Save the ride. He glanced at her. The oil lamp was between them, and in its light he looked younger than he had in the rain, less weathered, the fine lines around his eyes softening. You are practical, he said. I have had to be. There was a pause, the kind that has weight in it, and then he said, What happened in Abilene? She had not expected the question, and he had not expected to ask it. They both seemed to register this at the same time. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them. My father died. He left debts I did not know about. A man I was engaged to made the situation worse. She paused. He took money that was mine, what was left after the farm was settled. Did he take it by force? He took it by trust, she said. Which is worse? Orville was quiet for a moment. What was his name? Silas Prout. He looked at her. What was he? A cattle broker, or so he claimed. I think mostly he was a man who was very good at being believed. I am sorry that happened to you. She looked at him directly. I am not interested in being pitied. That was not pity, he said quietly. That was courtesy. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and something passed between them that was too early to be named and too real to be ignored. She looked back down at the ledger. You should write the letter to Harmer's Supply, she said. I can draft it if you like. I can write my own letters, he said, with a flash of something that was almost amusement. Though I appreciate the offer. She smiled without looking up, and he watched her smile for one unguarded second before he looked away. October came with its particular quality of golden light, the kind that makes West Texas look almost gentle. The pecan trees along the creek that ran the eastern edge of the Donnelly property dropped their leaves in long spiraling showers, and the air sharpened into something clean and cold in the mornings. Mae had been on the ranch for 4 weeks. She had repaired 3 sections of fence while Orville and the hands were working the far pastures, re-waterproofed the barn roof using pitch and tar paper from the general store in Colby, reorganized the larder by weight and season, and planted a winter crop of turnips and collard greens in the kitchen garden. She had not been asked to do most of these things. She had simply seen what needed doing and done it. Orville noticed every single one. He did not say much about it. He was not, Mae had come to understand, a man of excessive words. He was careful with language the way some men were careful with money, spending it only when the return was clear. But she caught the evidence of his noticing in small things. The new pair of boots that appeared on the bunkhouse step one morning, her size, good leather, left there without a note or a word said at breakfast. The fact that the section of kitchen floor that had been uneven since some settling had occurred was suddenly even one evening after he had spent an hour in there with a planing tool and a level while she was in the garden. The way he began, without discussion, leaving the coffee pot on the stove instead of taking it off so that she could have a second cup in the mid-morning without building the fire again. She noticed these things the way she noticed the gap in a roof seam, with precision and attention. Colby was a small town, as West Texas towns went in 1881, with a main street that ran 4 blocks, a general store, a church, a saloon that was also sometimes a hotel, a livery, and a post office that shared a wall with the telegraph office. Mae went in once a week with the wagon to collect supplies, and within 2 visits, she had established the particular kind of social geography that small towns require. She knew who the postmistress was, a formidable woman named Edna Birch who had opinions about everything and kept a cat behind the counter. And she knew the man at the general store, Harmer himself, a tall Pennsylvanian with a red mustache who had indeed been charging Donnelly Ranch twice for fence wire, and was embarrassed enough about it to reduce the next 2 months of orders by way of apology. She knew the preacher, a gentle older man named Reverend Sparks, and she knew the doctor, a young man called Dr. Ellison who had come from Baltimore 18 months prior and was still visibly adjusting to the dust. She also knew, after her 3rd visit to town, that people were talking about her. This was not unexpected. A woman traveling alone and ending up employed at a bachelor rancher's property was always going to generate commentary. She heard the shape of it without hearing the specific words, the way you hear a conversation 2 rooms away, not the content but the tone. She walked through it with her back straight and her eyes forward and bought her cornmeal and her salt pork and her lamp oil, and drove the wagon home with the same composure she brought to everything. She mentioned it to no one. But Cutter Hayes, who was sharper than he appeared and had a gift for peripheral awareness, caught the set of her jaw when she came back from town that 3rd week, and he mentioned it quietly to Orville that evening by the barn. Orville rode into Colby the following Friday. Mae did not know what he said or to whom, but when she went into town the next week, Edna Birch greeted her by name with unusual warmth, and 3 women who had previously found reasons to look at the middle distance when she passed stopped to speak to her in front of the general store. One of them was a woman named Clara Hollis, the wife of the neighboring rancher, who had broad hands and a direct manner that Mae immediately liked. Clara Hollis said, matter-of-factly, that she had heard Mae was the best cook in the county and asked if she would share her cornbread recipe. Mae said she would. She did not ask Orville what he had said in town. But at supper that evening she made a dried peach cobbler that he had mentioned once, in passing, had been his mother's recipe, and she set it on the table without comment, and she saw him look at it for a moment with an expression that had nothing to do with dessert. "How did you know my mother made peach cobbler?" he asked. "You mentioned it," she said. 3 weeks ago, you said the peach tree on the south side of the house had been planted by her." He was quiet for a long moment. Cutter and Pinto Jack exchanged one of their wordless communications across the table, and both became very interested in their coffee. "She planted it the first spring they were here," Orville said. "She said she wanted to make sure there was always something sweet on the property even when times were hard. She sounds like a sensible woman. She was the best person I ever knew." There was something raw in the way he said it, not performed but genuine, and Mae looked at him across the table and said softly, "When did you lose her?" 4 years ago. Fever, it was fast." He paused. "My father went the following winter, I think mostly from the grief." "I am sorry," Mae said. She did not add anything to it, did not soften it with pleasantries, because she understood instinctively that this was a man who wanted honesty more than comfort. But she held his gaze for a moment, and what she put into it was real, and he knew it. "Thank you," he said, simply, meaning it. The night after that, after the men had gone to bed, me sat on the porch steps of the main house. She had moved from the bunkhouse to the spare room in the house after the first week, as Orville had originally offered, and looked at the Texas sky, which was doing what it sometimes did in October, arranging itself into something so vast and dense with stars that it felt physical, like a weight you could lean against. She heard the door open behind her and did not turn around, and Orville sat down on the step beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold night air. They did not speak for a long time. "Why west?" he asked eventually. "Why not back to family in Abilene?" "I have no family in Abilene. My father was the last of it. I have a cousin in California, but I have not seen her since I was 12, and I am not sure she would recognize me." "And the man, Prout, did you love him?" It was a direct question, and she answered it directly. "I thought I did. I think I loved the idea of what he represented: stability, a future, a place to belong." She looked at the stars. "I have come to understand that those are different things." "What is the difference?" "Loving a person means you see them clearly and love what you see. Loving the idea of them means you are mostly in love with your own hope." She paused. "I was in love with my own hope. He was not worth it." Orville was quiet for a moment. "I had a situation something like that once," he said. "Not a man taking from me, but a woman I thought I would marry. She came out here one summer, a cousin of a friend from back east. I thought I had found something. She left in September." "Why?" "She said this land was too much, too empty, too hard. She wanted a city and a proper society and a man who would fit into it." "She was not wrong about what she wanted," Mee said. "No," he agreed. "She was right about what she wanted. She was wrong about what she told me before she left." "Which was?" "That this place was not worth the effort." He said it without bitterness, just fact. "It is the finest place I have ever known. I built everything you see from nothing. Every post, every beam, every animal. It is worth every hour of it." Me looked around at the dark ranch, the dark shapes of the fences, the barn, the oak tree by the bunkhouse, the peach tree on the south side of the house catching moonlight through its bare branches. "It is," she said. He looked at her profile for a moment in the dark and said nothing more, but when they both went inside half an hour later, and the house settled into its night quiet, something had shifted between them, the kind of shift that happens without announcement, like the way a river changes course, gradually and then all at once. November arrived and brought with it the first real chill of the season, and with it a series of complications that kept the ranch in motion. One of the two workhorses, an older gray gelding called Broker, came up lame with a stone bruise on his left foreleg, which meant Orville had to rethink the schedule for hauling winter feed. A section of the northern pasture fence came down in a windstorm, and 20 head of cattle got through into the neighboring Holly's property, which required a morning of retrieval and an afternoon of repairs, and an evening of genuine embarrassment when Orville had to go hat in hand to Tom Holly's and explain. Tom Holly's was a large, good-natured man who laughed it off entirely, and then invited Orville and his household to Sunday dinner, which was how me met Clara Holly's properly. Clara Holly's was 43, originally from Tennessee, and had been in West Texas long enough to have opinions about it that were both specific and deeply informed. She had 5 children ranging in age from 8 to 19, a kitchen that could have fed a small army, and the particular social intelligence of a woman who had spent 20 years being the center of a community without anyone realizing she was doing it. She took to me immediately and without preamble. "You fixed the bunkhouse roof yourself," Clara said, over the washing up while the men talked cattle on the porch. "There was a gap forming," Me said. "Orville has been needing someone to take charge of that place," Clara said. "Not just the roof, the whole of it. He runs a good ranch, but a man alone does not always see what is right in front of him." She handed me a dish to dry. "He is a good man, Me. I say that as someone who has watched him build that ranch from raw land over 8 years. He is as honest as the day and twice as stubborn, but he is good down to the bone. Me dried the dish carefully. I am his cook, she said. Clara smiled, and in that smile was the collected wisdom of a woman who had watched a great many things play out and knew the difference between what people said and what was true. Of course you are, she said pleasantly, and handed her another dish. The Sunday dinners at the Hollies Ranch became a regular fixture through November and December, which meant that me and Orville found themselves driving the wagon there and back together every week, a 40-minute ride each way across the open Texas plain. They talked on those rides the way people talk when the landscape is big enough to make honesty easier without the social scaffolding that indoor conversations carry. She told him about growing up on the Fletcher farm, about her father's particular way of teaching her things, about the drought of 1876 that had nearly broken the farm the first time, about the pleasure she took in a well-done repair and the satisfaction of a thing set right. He told her about building the barn in the summer of 1875, working alongside a Comanche man named Stanzinwater who had taught him 3 things that changed how he built everything after. Level from the ground up, never cut a corner in the foundation, and always build as if you are building for your children's children. He said this last one quietly, and me felt the longing in it, the way a person reveals a thing they want very much without quite admitting they want it. December deepened, and the cold settled into the bones of the land. Christmas came, and me made a proper celebration of it despite the remote location, a pine branch draped over the mantel, a roast chicken since a turkey was not to be had, a pudding made from what the larder offered, and a small gift for each of the men, which she had made herself. A new pair of work gloves for Cutter from leather she had cut and stitched from an old coat, a wool cap for Pinto Jack who was always losing his, and for Orville, a map. She had drawn it herself on a good piece of paper, a detailed map of the ranch property showing every fence line, every water source, every grazing area, with notes on soil quality and weather exposure along each section. She had based it on her own observations over 2 months of walking the property, and it was, she knew, more accurate than anything he currently had. She rolled it and tied it with a bit of ribbon. He opened it on Christmas morning at the kitchen table, spreading it out carefully, and studied it for a long time without speaking. She stood at the stove, pretending to be interested in the coffee, and did not turn around. When he spoke, his voice was different from his usual tone, lower and quieter, like something that had been set down carefully. Me. It may not be precisely correct in the northeast corner, she said to the stove. I could not get over there as much as I would have liked before the cold set in. Me. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before and could not entirely categorize, though something in the vicinity of her chest seemed to know exactly what it was. This is the finest gift anyone has given me in years, he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then said, it is a practical thing, because she needed to say something that was manageable. The best things are, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not about maps at all. Cutter Hayes took Pinto Jack into Colby for the Christmas evening celebrations, leaving the ranch house to its own quiet. Me made supper for 2, simple and good beans and ham and the last of the sweet potato stores, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them and the wind, talking against the windows outside. After the meal they sat in the front room by the fire, which was the first time me had been in the front room in the evening, having always retired to her room while Orville read by the fire alone. But it was Christmas, and he had asked her to stay, and she had. He had a book of poetry. Robert Browning, the spine said, worn smooth from handling. He read 2 poems aloud, and she listened, and then she asked to look at the book and read one herself, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's 43rd sonnet, which she knew by heart but found on the page anyway and read in a quiet voice that did not waver. When she finished, the room was very still. You know that poem, he said. My mother had it on a sampler on the wall, she said. I read it so many times I could not know it, He looked at the fire. "How do I love thee?" he said softly, not performing it, just saying the words the way you say words that have gotten under your skin. My mother had a favorite poem too. She used to say that poetry was the only honest conversation people ever had with each other. She was right, me said. He looked at her then in the firelight, with the full and unguarded attention he rarely gave anything outside of his ranch work, and me looked back at him, and the moments stretched between them like wire being drawn tight, taut and vibrating. She was the one who looked away first, not from shyness but from the recognition that some things, when they happen, need to happen slowly and with the full weight of certainty behind them. January came in cold and blue-skied and implacable, the way January in West Texas often does, brilliant weather that lies about its kindness, clear days that cut to the bone by mid-afternoon. The cattle required more attention in the cold. The water troughs needed breaking each morning, and Broker the gray gelding developed an abscess that required twice daily poulticing and made him ill-tempered enough that only me could work around him without getting nipped. She had a gift with the horse, a patience that matched his discomfort without submitting to it, and Orville watched her work with the gelding one morning from the fence rail with his coffee cooling in his hand, and felt something he had been refusing to name settle into a shape he could not ignore. He was in love with Mae Fletcher. He had known it, in the particular honest way he knew most things, slowly and then undeniably, for some weeks. He had been sitting with it the way you sit with a decision that has large consequences, examining it from multiple angles, looking for the flaw. He found none. She was steady and real and capable and funny in a dry, sidelong way that caught him off guard reliably, and she had a quality of attention that made a person feel genuinely seen, which was rarer than almost anything he could think of. She had arrived in a storm with a split boot and no horse, and had fixed his bunkhouse roof before he woke up, and every day since had been like a proof being assembled, evidence accumulating toward a conclusion he could no longer argue with. The question was what to do about it. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. He was also not a man who let important things go unsaid forever, having watched his father fail to say the things that needed saying until his mother was gone, and it was too late. But Mae had come to this place running from a man who had betrayed her trust, had made herself indispensable through work and competence and sheer force of integrity, and the last thing he wanted to do was make her feel as though she had merely traded one complicated situation for another. He needed to be sure. He needed to know whether what he felt was something she was even willing to consider, whether the warmth he thought he saw when she looked at him was real or a reflection of his own wanting. He got his answer in the end, not from anything said, but from a moment in the barn on a Thursday evening in late January. He had been working late on repairing a broken harness, the oil lamp hanging from a nail above the workbench, and Mae had come out to tell him supper would wait if he needed more time, and he had said another quarter hour, and she had leaned against the barn door and watched him work. He was concentrating on a particularly stubborn buckle and did not look up, and she watched his hands, large, scarred, precise in their movements, and he caught her watching when he glanced up for the awl, and she did not look away. She held his gaze for 5 full seconds with an expression of such unguarded transparency that Orville Donnelly, who had built 200 acres of ranch with his own hands and was not frightened of very much, felt his heart turn over in his chest like a new season. "Me," he said. "The harness can wait," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. He set the harness down. He stood up from the workbench. He crossed the barn toward her in 3 steps and stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she had to look up at him, and she did. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me," she said. "I am not a man who says things I do not mean," he said. "I need you to know that before I say this." "I know that," she said, and she did. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since at least October, probably longer, and I have been trying to find the right way to say it, and I think the right way is just to say it." The barn was very quiet around them. Mae looked at him for what felt like a very long time, and then she said, "I love you too, Orville, She said it plainly, the way she said everything without performance or decoration. I have been afraid to, because the last time I loved someone it cost me a great deal. But you are not him. You are as far from him as Texas is from the moon, and I think I have known that from the first morning. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and then he stepped closer, and she raised her face, and he kissed her in the barn with the lantern swinging slightly above them and the horses shifting in their stalls and the cold January air at the door. And it was the kind of kiss that contains everything that has been held back for months, careful and certain and true. When they came in for supper, Cutter Hayes looked at them for 1 second, took in the changed quality of the air between them, and quietly put a third piece of cornbread on Pinto Jack's plate before the younger man could notice and say something unfortunate. Mae sat down and served the stew, and Orville sat at the head of the table, and they looked at each other once, briefly, and then looked at their plates, and both of them were smiling in a way that neither of them could stop. February brought a cold snap that lasted 2 weeks, the worst of the winter, and the ranch battened down against it. Mae and Orville spent the long evenings together in the front room, reading and talking and occasionally playing at cards, and the easy naturalness of it settled around them like something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. They talked about everything, about what the ranch could be in 5 years, about whether the water rights along the Eastern Creek needed to be formally recorded before someone else laid claim to them, about the territorial politics that were shifting as Texas developed, about books and memory, and what they each believed about the nature of things. Cutter and Pinto Jack treated the development with a warm and careful tact, which was to say they said absolutely nothing about it to anyone's face, and merely adjusted their behavior accordingly, giving the main house more privacy in the evenings and finding reasons to be elsewhere on Sunday afternoons. On the 14th of February, Orville came into the kitchen at noon with a small thing in his hand, a piece of turquoise, deep blue-green, about the size of a walnut, smooth and beautiful, threaded on a thin piece of rawhide. He put it on the table beside her coffee cup without a word. She picked it up and held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment. "Where did you get this?" "I have had it for 12 years, he said. "I found it in the creek bed the first summer I was here. I have always thought it was the color of a good sky before a storm." She tied it around her neck herself, and he watched her do it, and there was something so domestic and intimate about the moment that he had to look at the wall. "I have nothing to give you," she said. "You gave me a map of my own ranch," he said, "and you fixed my bunkhouse roof. I think we are well ahead." She laughed, which she did not do often enough, and it filled the kitchen with something warm that lingered the rest of the day. March arrived, and with it the matter of the land deed. It came about this way. Tom Hollis rode over one Sunday morning with a newspaper from the territorial capital, and over coffee he spread it on the kitchen table, and pointed to a notice that had been running for 3 weeks in various West Texas papers. A land claims dispute had been filed against 2 properties in Colby County, not Donnelly Ranch, but 2 neighbors to the east, by a railroad company claiming rights-of-way that predated the original land grants. The notices were complicated and lawyerly, but the substance of them was this: if you had a land deed issued before 1873 and had not properly registered it with the county office as required under the new territorial statutes of 1879, your claim could be contested. Orville pulled out his deed. It was a single document, proper and signed, issued in 1873 when his father had taken the land. But he had never registered it under the 1879 statutes because he had not known about them, which was true of many ranchers in the area. "You need to get that into the county recorder's office in Colby before the end of the month," Tom said. "The deadline for the registration window is March 31st. Orville turned the deed over in his hands, reading the formal language. Mae was at the other end of the table reading through the newspaper notice, and she said without looking up, "He is right. The 1879 statute required re-registration, but the notice period was only published in papers from the eastern part of the state. Most ranchers out here never saw it. She looked up. Orville, you should ride in today. Today is Sunday. The recorder's office is closed today, Tom agreed. But first thing Monday. Mae looked at the deed. She had never held a deed before, not in her own name. She had watched her father's deed be handed over to the bank at the age of 25, the piece of paper that represented everything he had built, surrendered for debts that had felt larger than the land itself. She set Orville's deed down on the table carefully. Go Monday, she said. First thing. He went Monday. He rode into Colby at dawn, reached the recorder's office when it opened at 8, and had the deed re-registered under the 1879 statutes by 9 o'clock, with a certified copy issued and the original sealed and stamped. He rode home with both documents in his breast pocket, against his heart, the way his father had told him his grandfather used to carry the deed to the family farm in Ohio, because a man should always know where his land is. He came in through the kitchen door and put both documents on the table in front of me, who was kneading bread. She looked at them, looked at him, looked at his face. Done, she said. Done, he said. She went back to the bread. He poured himself coffee and sat down and looked at the two documents on the table, and then looked at me's hands in the bread dough, and felt the whole weight of everything he had, the land, the house, the cattle, the fences, the peach tree on the south side, and felt the absence of the one thing that would make it complete. He had been thinking about how to say what he wanted to say since February. He had been thinking about whether it was right to say it, whether it was too much too soon, whether he was reading the situation correctly. He looked at Mae Fletcher at his kitchen table, doing what she had been doing since October with the quiet competence and warmth that he had come to understand as simply the way she existed in the world, and he stopped thinking about whether. Me, he said. She looked up, reading his tone. I want you to have a deed of your own, he said. She stilled. Her hand stopped in the bread. Not this one, he said quickly. I am not handing you the ranch. I am asking you to share it. I want to marry you, Mae. I want this to be your land as much as mine. He stopped, gathered himself. I am not a man who talks around things, but I seem to be talking around this. What I mean is that I love you and I want you to be my wife, and I want your name on this deed beside mine, because this land deserves someone who will look at it the way you do, and I do not want to live here without you. The kitchen was very still. Mae looked at him for a long moment, her hands pressed flat on the bread dough, flour to the wrist. The turquoise piece he had given her in February rested at the base of her throat. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink, and it fell across her in a way that made her look like a painting of something that was actually real. Yes, she said. He breathed. Yes, yes, I will marry you. She looked at him with that warm, clear, direct look that had been undoing him since October. And yes to the deed, though I want it known that I am not marrying you for the land. I know that, he said. He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen, and she turned to face him with flour on her hands, and he took both her hands anyway and held them, flour and all, and she looked up at him with the full brightness of that smile. I told you I was only staying 2 months, she said. You told me you would reassess after 2 months, he corrected. So I did, she said. He kissed her in the kitchen with the bread waiting on the table and the morning light coming through the window and the smell of coffee and flour in the air. And it was better than the barn kiss in January, because it was less tentative, because they knew now what they were to each other, and because this time he did not let her go. They were married in April. Reverend Sparks performed the ceremony in the Colby Church on the second Saturday of April, 1882, with the peach tree back home just beginning to blossom, which Mae took as a good sign. Clara and Tom Hollies were witnesses. Cutter Hayes wore his only good shirt and stood straight-backed in the front pew. Pinto Jack cried, which he would deny for the rest of his natural life, and which Cutter would mention periodically for the same duration. Edna Birch attended and brought a fruit cake wrapped in muslin, and told me that she was the best thing to happen to this part of Texas since the railroad came through, by which she meant it as the highest possible compliment. Mae wore a dress that Clara Hollies had helped her make from fabric ordered from San Antonio blue calico, simple and pretty, nothing elaborate, which was exactly what Mae wanted. She had let Clara talk her into a few ounces of lace at the collar and cuffs, which she did not regret. She carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that she had picked herself from the creek bank that morning, blue bonnets and Indian paintbrush, the first color of spring. Orville wore his best coat and had shaved properly, which made him look younger and different enough that Pinto Jack had done a small double take when he came out of the house. He stood at the front of the church and watched me come up the aisle, and his expression was the most uncomplicated thing me had ever seen on a human face. Pure, unguarded happiness. She took his hand at the altar and did not let it go until Reverend Sparks told them they were married, and then she held it still, and he held hers, and they walked out of that church into the April sunshine as Orville and Mae Donnelly, and the wind smelled like cedar and new grass, and the whole open possibility of a life built with both hands. The weeks after the wedding moved with the particular kind of joy that is quiet rather than loud, not fireworks but warmth, steady and constant. They settled into a shared life, with an ease that surprised neither of them and delighted both. The ranch became something slightly different with two people at the center of it, the way a house changes when it is fully occupied, a deeper resonance, a fuller sound, more purpose in the routines that had previously been solitary. Orville had his deed reissued in May, as he had promised. He rode to the county recorder's office and had the document amended to reflect both names. Orville and Mae Donnelly, joint holders of the Donnelly Ranch property, 312 acres in Colby County, Texas. When he brought the new deed home, he spread it on the kitchen table and they both looked at it together, at both their names in the county clerk's careful script, and Mae put her finger on the M of her name and traced it once. "It is real," she said. "It has always been yours," he said. "The paper is just the county's acknowledgement." She looked at him, and he saw her eyes bright in a way she rarely let them be, and she wrapped her arms around him and pressed her face against his shoulder, and he held her in the kitchen with the deed on the table, and the afternoon coming through the windows golden and warm. The summer of 1882 was a good one. The cattle herd grew. The winter wheat had yielded well. Broker the gray gelding recovered fully from his abscess and went back to work with only a minor grudge. And Mae's kitchen garden produced more than it ever had, the rows of vegetables thick and productive in the long Texas summer light. She had expanded the garden southward into a section of ground Orville had cleared for her in May, and by July it was growing tomatoes and corn and beans and squash alongside the turnips and collard greens she had planted in the fall. Cutter Hayes, who had spent 3 years eating the combined cooking of himself and Orville, which was functional at best, had taken on a slightly stunned air of gratitude that persisted well into the second year of Mae's tenure and expressed itself in small ways. He fixed the gate on the chicken yard without being asked, repaired the step on the porch that had been slightly loose since winter, and once brought me a small bunch of wildflowers from the south pasture with an expression of determined casualness that made Orville bite his lip to keep from smiling. Pinto Jack had developed an ambition, it turned out. He had been quietly teaching himself to read, using a primer that Mae had found in the bottom of her carpetbag and given him without ceremony in the winter. And by summer, he was working through a second-hand copy of a cattle management guide that Tom Hollies had lent him. He had plans to eventually run his own operation. Mae encouraged this without managing it, the way she did most things, by being available for questions and staying out of the way of the actual work. In August, Mae began to suspect she was carrying a child. She did not say anything for 3 weeks, not from fear, but from the particular private joy of knowing something momentous before it becomes a shared fact. She let herself have those weeks of holding it quietly, of looking at the ranch and the house, and the man she had married and feeling the future expand in all directions like a map being unrolled. She told Orville on a Sunday evening in early September, sitting on the porch steps where they had sat on that first October night, looking at the Texas sky that was doing its dramatic thing with the sunset, turning the whole western horizon into layers of orange and gold and deep purple. "I think we are going to have a child," she said. He turned to look at her. The sunset was on his face. He looked at her for a long, still moment. "When?" he said, which was not, she knew, the first question in his heart, but it was the practical one he led with because he was who he was. "Spring," she said. "March or April, I think." He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand the same way he had taken it at the altar in April and held it carefully, and when she looked at his face he was looking at the sunset with an expression that was so full it had nowhere to go. "A spring baby," he said. "When the peach tree blooms," she said. He looked at her then, and what was in his face was everything gratitude and love, and the particular awe of a man who has built something, and cannot quite believe how complete it has become. He pulled her toward him gently, and she rested against him with her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sunset finish its business over West Texas in silence, her hand in his, the warm evening settling around the ranch like a benediction. Cutter and Pinto Jack received the news at supper the following week with reactions that were characteristic. Cutter congratulated them quietly, and then spent the next 20 minutes being extremely busy with his coffee cup, and Pinto Jack said, "That is the best news I have heard in my life," with such genuine enthusiasm that even the reserved Cutter smiled. Clara Hollies arrived the following Saturday, apparently via the instinct of women who know these things in advance, with a basket containing a quilt, 2 jars of preserved peaches, and 17 opinions about what Mae should and should not do during the coming months. Mae accepted the quilt and the peaches and listened to the opinions with the tolerant patience she applied to everything, and Clara, who was sharp enough to know she was being tolerated, laughed and said, "You are going to be a wonderful mother, and I am going to fuss over you regardless." "I know," Mae said, and hugged her. The fall and winter passed with the ranch in good order and Mae in good health, which she took as a personal project, eating well and sleeping properly, and doing her customary work around the property with the modifications that common sense required. Orville was careful in a way that was never overbearing. He did not try to stop her doing things, but he had a quiet habit of appearing just when something needed lifting, which she chose not to comment on. They had many conversations that winter about the future, about what the ranch would be for a child growing up on it, about what they wanted for that child, about whether they hoped for a boy or a girl, and what they would name either. On the matter of a name, they had a long and productive argument over 2 Sunday evenings that ranged across family names, classical names, and the names of things they loved, rivers, seasons, qualities, and ended, for a boy, on Thomas Chester Donnelly, Chester for Mae's father, Thomas for Tom Hollies, who had been a good neighbor and a good friend. For a girl, they settled on Ruth, which had been Orville's mother's name. "I hope it is a boy," Mae said, not because she had a preference exactly, but because she wanted to give Orville's mother's name to a child who could grow up knowing it meant something specific. "Either," Orville said. "Either is everything." The baby was born on the 2nd of April, 1883, in the bedroom of the main house with Dr. Ellison in attendance and Clara Hollies there by preference, because Mae had decided she wanted someone who had done this before, and Clara had done it 5 times. The labor was long but not dangerous, and at 4 in the afternoon a boy arrived into the West Texas spring with a voice that Cutter Hayes, waiting in the kitchen, said he could hear from the barn. Thomas Chester Donnelly. He had Orville's dark hair and Mae's brown eyes, and a quality of alert attention that was recognizable as hers from the first week. Orville held his son in the bedroom with the late April light coming through the window, and Mae watched his face, the full, overwhelmed, helpless love on it, and felt something complete itself in her that had been in the process of completion since a stormy night the previous September when a stranger had offered her a dry roof, and a woman with a split boot had fixed his in return. The ranch went on. That is the right way to say it, because the ranch was not a backdrop but a living thing, and it went on with them in it. The years passed the way good years do, with the texture of real-life difficulty and ease, loss and gain, weather and work, and the steady accumulation of a life built well. Cutter Hayes fell in love the following spring with the postmistress of the neighboring town of Riley, a quiet, observant woman named Adeline Park who had come from Georgia and had the calm efficiency of someone who has managed a great deal alone. The courtship was methodical and dignified, conducted largely through letters and Sunday visits, and me watched it with the particular pleasure of someone who recognizes genuine feeling when she sees it. Cutter and Adeline were married in the fall of 1884, and Cutter remained at the ranch for 3 more years before he and Adeline started their own operation 12 miles to the north, on land they had been saving for. They remained close neighbors and closer friends. Pinto Jack, whose given name was Henry, had saved enough by 1886 to buy a small parcel of land west of Colby and began ranching on his own, starting with 20 head of cattle, and an ambition that me had long since determined was unstoppable. He came back to the Donnelly Ranch for holidays for years afterward, always staying one night in the bunkhouse for the sentiment of it, and always with some new story about what he was building. Orville hired 2 new hands in 1884, brothers named the Vargases, Eduardo and Marco, sons of a Mexican cattle-working family from south of the border, who had come north looking for solid work with a fair employer. Orville had a reputation by then in the county for being exactly that, and the Vargas brothers proved to be as good as any hands the ranch had ever had. Me learned what Spanish she did not already know and communicated with their mother, Senora Vargas, who sent occasional packages of dried chilies and spices, in a mixture of Spanish and English and sheer goodwill that transcended both. The ranch expanded. By 1885, Orville had increased the herd to 350 head, added a second barn, improved the irrigation along the creek, and formally recorded the water rights that me had identified as unregistered back in 1882. The Donnelly Ranch had a reputation in Colby County, not just for the quality of its cattle, but for the quality of its management. And the property map that me had drawn by hand in 1881 had been refined and redrawn 3 times since, but still hung, framed, on the wall of the front room where they had first read poetry together by the fire. In 1885 they had a second child, a daughter, and her name was Ruth, and she came into the world in March when the peach tree was just beginning to show its first buds, and Orville held her and said her name very quietly as if it were something precious that had been lost and was found, and me watched him and understood exactly what it was. Thomas, who was 2, regarded his sister with the grave suspicion appropriate to his age, and within 3 weeks had appointed himself her protector with an authority that no one had granted, and he considered entirely self-evident. Me watched her son stand guard over his sister's cradle with a small, serious face and her father's determined jaw, and felt the particular love that comes from recognizing someone. The town of Colby grew through the 1880s. The railroad came through in 1886, bringing with it the usual disruption and opportunity, new businesses and new people, and new conversations about what Colby County was becoming. Me was part of those conversations in ways that mattered. She was on the committee that organized the county school board in 1886, having felt, since the first year, that the education available to the children of ranch families in the area was inadequate. She worked alongside Clara Hollies and Adeline Cutter, now Hayes, and 2 other women in the county, and by 1887 Colby had a proper schoolhouse with a paid teacher, a woman named Miss Devereaux from Missouri who arrived with an extraordinary collection of books and a precise enthusiasm for mathematics. Thomas started school in 1889. He rode in on a small sorrel pony that Orville had spent 4 months training to be gentle enough for a 6-year-old, and came home that first day with dirt on his knees, and an opinion about long division that had the structure. Me noted of his father's arguments, methodical, slightly stubborn, ultimately correct. Ruth, 3 years younger, would follow him in due course, and would prove to be the more academically inclined of the two, which surprised no one who had watched her from infancy, with a focused intensity that her mother recognized as intimately familiar. They had a third child in 1888, another boy, whom they named James, after no one in particular, because they had simply liked the name for years and had been saving it. James Donnelly arrived in September and announced himself with a quiet, watchful quality that became, as he grew, a remarkable observational intelligence. He noticed everything as his mother did, and drew conclusions from those observations as his father did, and the combination made him, from a very early age, the most alarming person to try to keep a secret from. The seasons turned and the decade turned and the ranch went on. In the spring of 1890, Orville sat down beside me on the porch steps, the same porch steps where they had sat on that October night and that Christmas night and the night she had told him about the baby, and watched their 3 children in the yard. Thomas, 7, was attempting to teach Ruth, 4, to throw a rope, with mixed results and considerable laughter. James, 2, was sitting in the dirt eating a piece of cornbread with the focused contentment of a philosopher who has found his subject. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Orville said. "Tell me," said me. "That night in the rain," he said. "I opened the door and you were standing there with your boot coming apart and that carpetbag in your hand, and you told me you needed shelter and you did not beg, you just stated it." Me smiled at the yard. "I remember. I almost sent you to the barn." "You did not, though." "I did not," he agreed. "And then I woke up the next morning and you had fixed my roof. It needed fixing." "So did a great many things," he said, and what he meant was clear and true and not only about roofs. She looked at him sidelong, the same sideways look she had been giving him for nearly a decade now, the one that contained everything she felt without being sentimental about it. He looked back at her with the gray-green eyes she knew as well as she knew this land, this house, these children in the yard. "I was heading west," she said. "You got there," he said. She leaned against him the way she had leaned against him on that September evening, when she told him about the baby, her shoulder against his arm, and they sat in the spring afternoon and watched their children and the peach tree in full bloom along the south wall of the house, its blossoms the pale pink of a good sky before dawn, and the grass of West Texas coming in green and thick as far as the eye could reach, all of it theirs, all of it real. A hawk moved in a slow circle above the property, riding the warm air, and James in the yard pointed up at it, and said something in his 2-year-old's language that might have been bird or might have been something else entirely, and Ruth corrected him with the authority of a 4-year-old who considers herself expert, and Thomas, who was holding the rope and had opinions about both of them, managed to tangle himself in it while pronouncing those opinions. And the whole scene dissolved into a happy chaos of children and laughter and Texas sunshine. Orville and me watched from the porch steps, his hand finding hers somewhere in the middle of the laughter, and she held it the way she held everything she cared about, carefully and completely, with the full intention of keeping it. The deed was in the house, in the drawer of the writing desk in the front room where the map still hung on the wall. "Orville and me Donnelly," it said, 312 acres. Colby County, Texas. Outside, the land was exactly that, theirs. The land and the house and the barn and the fences and the peach tree and the kitchen garden and the creek to the east with its water rights properly filed, and the bunkhouse with its neatly patched northeast corner, the 2 battens of pale wood now nearly as gray as the rest of the roof, so well fitted that you could only find them if you knew where to look. Me knew where to look. She always had. The hawk circled once more and then rose on a current of warm air and moved south over the open Texas plain, growing smaller against the wide and brilliant sky. And the Donnelly Ranch sat solid in the afternoon light, as it had sat for years and would sit for years to come, well-built, well-loved, and entirely, unchangeably, permanently home. Ruth had tripped on something in the yard and was now presenting a scraped knee to her father with the expression of one who expects immediate and full attention to the tragedy. Orville rose from the porch steps to attend to it, and Mae watched him cross the yard to his daughter and crouch down in the grass with the same patient attention. He gave everything that mattered to him, and she thought of the night she had arrived here in the rain, running from a life that had not worked out, and the morning she had fixed his roof before he woke, and every day since, and felt sitting in the April sunshine on the steps of the home she had helped build something that she had been looking for since long before she knew the word for it. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That was the whole of it, really. The whole of everything. The afternoon moved across the yard, the children settled into new occupations, and the ranch went on in the golden particular quiet of a spring day in West Texas. And Orville came back to the porch steps and sat beside his wife, and she handed him his coffee cup which she had kept warm, and he took it, and they sat together in the sunlight, and the story of how Mae Fletcher had come to be Mae Donnelly, and how a split-soled boot and a leaking bunkhouse roof and one honest man and one honest woman had made this life. That story was not a story anymore. It was just the truth of where they lived.